Insane asylums and lunatic asylums were the names given to mental hospitals in the early 20th century. Despite officials' lack of knowledge of effective treatment methods, they would incarcerate people against their will. U.S. psychiatric institution prisoners endured cruel treatment in 1900 that modern minds would call torture. So, let's take a peek at a mental institution in the United States around 1900 and see what it was like for patients. Firstly, make sure to subscribe to the Reality Threads channel. Leave a comment telling us what else you're interested in hearing about in the medical field. Very well, please hold on. Get ready for some wildness with this one. Not everyone voluntarily checked themselves into a mental institution in the early days. Even more so, involuntary admissions were the norm for most patients receiving treatment in American mental health institutions until the 1960s. Approximately 71% of patients in modern mental hospitals, on the other hand, are there of their own free will. The laws that enabled families to commit their relatives with little to no supporting evidence were a major contributor to the problem, as were the medical practices. For example, in 1860, Elizabeth Packard spent 3 years in an asylum for no other reason than her religious beliefs differing from her husband's, according to an Illinois statute. Also for dubious reasons, parents frequently committed their children to psychiatric facilities. Henry Fraser was sent to an asylum in New Orleans in 1883, after his mother deemed him unruly, claiming that he occupied himself to the point of fatigue via play. The hospital's own twisted financial incentives made the situation worse. That is, relatives whose families did not want to deal with might be bought out of the system. Well, I can understand the allure of that. Furthermore, patients may spend long amounts of time in mental facilities. Only 27.8% of American asylum inmates had spent less than a year in the institution by 1904. It was a long-term case for most of them. Due to the terrible treatment they received, some individuals with mental health concerns attempted to conceal their condition in order to evade being institutionalized. Their actions are understandable. Journalist Nellie Bly consented to go undercover at a mental institution in 1887 in order to document the conditions there. She detailed the dreadful way doctors treated her, including ripping out her hair and isolating her. Additionally, Bly condemned the inhumane treatment of patients. When she was having trouble sleeping, she would envision the devastation that would ensue in the event of a fire at the facility, as she detailed in her writings. It was nearly impossible to exit the structure, as Bly had noted that each door was individually locked and that all the windows were strongly barred. According to a doctor she had spoken with, there were 300 women housed in a single building, with 10 to a room. Plus, until someone manually unlocked the doors, there was no way to escape. Syphilis testing had become standard practice in many asylums for the mentally ill by the turn of the 20th century. Up until antibiotics were developed, syphilis could not be cured. However, in 1900, physicians at the Oregon State Hospital administered a course of treatment known as malarial treatment to newly infected individuals. Dr. Julius Wagner Jauregg initially proposed injecting malaria germs into patients' bloodstreams as a treatment. The idea was that malaria fever may kill syphilis. It's encouraging that half of these individuals reported fewer syphilis symptoms following the malaria infection, according to Wagner Jauregg's research. But less encouraging is the fact that at least 15% of patients died as a result of the treatment, according to the same study. Their use of it was unaffected, though. To put it gently, the first methods of treating mental disease were incredibly harsh. An asylum in England would spin people at high speeds in the early 19th century. At the tail end of the 19th century, other methods of treatment were still in use, such as slinging patients or branding them with hot irons to make them wake up. I guess you were hoping that, with time, medical technology would advance to the point where therapy would be better. However, that was completely incorrect. New kinds of torture were usually all that it entailed. In the 1930s, doctors started using disturbing new techniques, such as electroshock therapy and lobotomies, to treat mental disease. The insanity institution patients quickly learned that acting insane was their only option for escaping. "If you want to get out of here, you do just what the doctor says," one patient remarked, pretending to be in good health while you were not actually helped you escape that situation. The identical patient whose comment we just used later passed away due to natural causes. Around 1900, mental hospitals began admitting children as well as adults. Hundreds of minors, 16 and under, were evaluated for treatment needs by the Worcester County Asylum from 1854 until 1900. Nearly 200 children were admitted to the asylum based on their suicidal thoughts and aggressive tendencies. One study found that the children, admitted without seeing their families, had a high mortality rate. This is not shocking, given that the youngsters received the same treatment as any other patient, regardless of their age. Individual rooms or dorms were available for patients to sleep in within the mental institution. Nellie Bly detailed the conditions under which women slept, including 10 to a chamber with barred windows and locked doors. Additionally, we know that the sleeping quarters in the Oregon State Hospital were 7 by 14 feet. Dumbwaiters, which opened and closed as they traveled to prevent patients from escaping, were among the latest technologies reported in the 1883 Morning Oregonian about the hospital. The majestic architecture seen on the outside of mental hospitals is an ironic byproduct of reforms that advocated for the use of rest, beautiful architecture, and manicured grounds as treatments for mental disease in the late 19th century. In fact, the facilities were so wonderful that they occasionally attracted tourists. Even though the outside was peaceful, the hospital interior betrayed the belief that patients should be treated like captives. In 1900, long-term patients weren't the only ones who got terrible treatment in mental hospitals. It was common practice to provide degrading exams to freshly admitted patients right away. Patients were required to remove all clothing and valuables before receiving a bath at the Oregon State Hospital. After a medical examination, the hospital administered blood and syphilis tests to the patients. At last, they may be led to a room with window bars and then left alone. Women's institutions occasionally employed other processes. Nellie Bly claims that a doctor accused her of drug use during a medical evaluation that was part of her effort to establish whether she was mentally ill. One would assume that a mental institution would make it a point to clearly distinguish between patients and doctors, but that wasn't always the case. The uniform whiteness of the staff at Oregon State Hospital may be a bit misleading. No one on staff or in the patient population wore uniforms, according to that individual. This patient's initial encounter was with a man wearing a white apron. He mistook that individual for a waiter. The man in the apron was actually a patient, and he found out this after asking him a question. They were both in the same ward. Very uncomfortable. The patient, who was utterly bewildered throughout his involuntary commitment, finally came to the conclusion that, usually, the attendants are a little better dressed than the patients. On a daily basis, 125 patients at St. Elizabeth's, also known as the Government Hospital for the Insane, went through 17 dozen eggs, which Dr. Harry Hummer touted as an essential component of the sick patient's diet. Tea, 1 slice of bread, spoiled butter, and 5 prunes were the ingredients that Nellie Bly detailed in her supper. Following a covert 10-day stint at Bellevue Hospital, Bly wrote, "The eating was one of the most horrible things." Nevertheless, circumstances may differ. According to patients at a different asylum, the dining room had more of a restaurant or hotel vibe. As others served them, patients sat in close proximity to one another. Some facilities even saved money by growing their own food. Patients could work in the fields to boost their mental health, and the institution could save money. It was not uncommon for state mental hospitals to lodge several patients in extremely unpleasant barracks-like conditions. The situation was very much the same at New York's Bellevue Hospital. A sobbing woman who reportedly begged for her life for the better part of the night was covered by Nellie Bly. A second woman shouted, "Murder," over and over again. It's not easy to focus on your mental health in that setting. Reformers advocated for insane asylums in the 19th century. With the help of federal funds, the majority of states had established asylums to house the mentally ill by the 1870s. After opening in 1883, the Oregon State Hospital had already undergone 2 expansions by 1936. The facility had 2,400 patients under its care when I was there. Also, reformers advocated for the establishment of tranquil, well-kept estates as a means of treating mental disease. Typically, these would have architecturally stunning buildings and gardens for the patients to stroll in. There was a surge in asylum tourism in the latter half of the 19th century. Guidebooks recommended visiting the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane, which has one of the area's most expansive and picturesque views, according to one handbook. Doctors, who believed that a variety of illnesses could cause insanity, occasionally had no choice but to send their patients to insane asylums. Records from the New Orleans City Insane Asylum from the late 1800s contain doctors' notes detailing potential grounds for patient commitment. Because of the mental instability brought on by malaria, a man named Frank Kamba was confined. The doctor recommended William Burns' institutionalization after his fall from a horse and subsequent impact with his head, which allegedly caused brain atrophy. It was noted by doctors that Henry Schreiber had been a complete moron since birth, and the official diagnosis was congenital idiocy. Doctors determined that prolonged drinking was the cause of Jane Depasay's insanity, in her instance since she reportedly drank too much whiskey. In that case, what is your opinion? In what ways has mental health evolved throughout time? Please inform us by leaving a comment below. Also, be sure to watch a few more videos from our Reality Threads collection.